As we've often mentioned on the programme, the ancestral form of SARS-CoV-2 was probably a coronavirus which infected a species of bat, as yet unidentified. A paper this week revealed another bit of relevant biology we have in common with bats, horseshoe bats to be precise. It relates to the fight against infection that continues inside our cells even after the viruses have broken in, an aspect of immunity I'd not heard of till now. This molecular guerrilla warfare is carried out by an enzyme labelled OAS1, which stops viruses replicating in our cells. In most mammals, this molecule comes with a fatty tail or hook. It's prenellated, if you're a biochemist, which helps it to stick to the parts of cells where the replication happens. But those bats and many of us humans have a genetic defect that deletes the hook and leaves us more vulnerable to SARS-CoV-2. I'll let virologist Sam Wilson take up the story.
Some people who had the bad form of this gene were more likely to get severe COVID-19, whereas people who had another form, let's call it the good form, they were more protected from severe COVID-19. And what we found was that this change in the instructions in the people's DNA was actually specifying that a molecule of fat was put on the end of the defense that the OAS1 gene makes. If we think about the relevance of that, we have to sort of step back and remember what viruses are doing. So viruses are gaining entry to our cells, and they have to make lots and lots of copies of themselves because that's how their life cycle works. And viruses are very clever. They go to the place in the cell with all the machinery that's needed to make more copies of themselves. And in fact, coronaviruses are even more crafty than most viruses because not only do they go to the right place in the cell, they actually build their own room within the cell to hide from it.
I've seen micrographs showing some of this stuff, so that within the cell, there's this little bubble, as it were, and they're making themselves inside that. That hides them from all these molecules like this OAS1.
Exactly. And it's a really great strategy to sort of wrap yourself up in a little lipid membrane, create your own sort of little microenvironment, and it means that the cell can't tell that the virus is in there and replicating its genome.
And is the key word there lipid? That's the fancy word for fat.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
So this is a bit like the wall of the cell is made of fat, but this is a little fatty bubble inside which the virus sits and does its thing.
Exactly.
And does that connect then with what you're saying about this good or bad form of this OAS1 defensive molecule?
Absolutely. So the people with the good form, they tell the cell to put a little bit of fat on the end of the defense, and this actually sends the OAS1 defense to the little bubbles where the virus is replicating, and this allows the OAS1 molecule to detect the virus. Whereas people with the bad form, they don't have this little bit of lipid that's put on the end of the OAS1 defense, and so this doesn't go to those little rooms where the virus is replicating, and therefore the virus isn't detected.
When you say good and bad, what you're calling the bad form work with other viruses, it may still be doing some good, but it just doesn't work when you've got something as clever as a coronavirus.
That is a fascinating question. So I actually believe that what you've said is probably true, but I think the jury is officially still out on that. The interesting thing about the bad form of the gene is that actually it's the most common form of the gene in most human populations. Outside of people of African descent, the most common form of OAS1 is what we're calling the bad form here that doesn't block SARS-CoV-2. So why that has ended up being so common is a little bit of a mystery.
It presumably goes back to our sort of deep primate heritage. It's something we will have inherited from our animal ancestors.
Yeah, so it seems that the ancestral state, if we look in primates, is the ability to make the good form, the form that has the fat molecule on the end.
And this ties in with another story that some people who have Neanderthal ancestors have got the good form, as you're calling it.
Amazingly, so people have realized that there was this so-called Neanderthal haplotype, which is a collection of changes in DNA. And this was associated with protection. And it seems it's just this one SNP in OAS1 that's part of a piece of DNA that's been inherited from breeding with Neanderthals way back when. This has allowed the reintroduction of this protective form of OAS1 into modern human populations.
It seems to me a fascinating story, but it is more than fascinating in the sense that there's a correlation with how ill people can become. Is that right, with coronavirus?
Yeah, absolutely. So we looked in cohorts of patients with known disease outcome to see which forms of the OAS1 defense they were making. And what we found was that people who were unable to make the prenylated form of OAS1, they were much more likely to get severe COVID-19. They had an increased odds of getting severe disease of about 50%. You can easily rationalize how that might work. If the cell is reducing the amount of virus replication, then it kind of just tips the balance in favor of the rest of the immune system, because it just becomes easier to deal with because there probably isn't as much virus. Although more work needs to be done to actually demonstrate that that is the mechanism of how that's working.
You did mention that people from Africa are more likely to have the good form. Does that have any implications for the spread of the disease or the severity of the disease as is being reported from Africa?
So if we look at the situation in the UK, so probably about 55% of people have the good form of OAS1. But if we look in some African populations, then it can be as high as 85% or 90%. At this point, we move into the realm of speculation. But because the changes in the instructions in the DNA that are associated with severe COVID-19 disease have also been implicated in susceptibility to SARS-CoV-2 infection, if you have more people in a population that are able to express the protective form of OAS1, then it could have the ability to reduce the spread of viruses. But that's currently speculative and unproven.
The other thing is the title of your paper mentions a connection with bats from which this coronavirus first originated.
It's believed that SARS-CoV-2 originates in horseshoe bats, and it's been transmitted to humans either directly from those bats or perhaps through an intermediate species. And sort of understanding how this OAS1 defense works, understanding the molecular basis of the block allowed us to look beyond humans at other animals. And what we found is actually that in most animals, this sort of default ancestral status is to make this prenylated defense, the good form that has the lipid modification that can presumably block viruses like SARS-CoV-2. And in fact, humans are probably quite unusual in the fact that there are large numbers of individuals, probably billions of individuals, that are unable to make this defense. And remarkably, when we looked in horseshoe bats, we realized that they are also a species that's unable to make this prenylated form of OAS1. So they are also unusual in the animal kingdom.
That's really strange. I mean, we've had conversations in the past with the zoologists about the fact that bats seem to be able to tolerate these, for us, very dangerous viruses. Is that part of the story somehow, part of the coexistence story, or it's a confusing thing? Because presumably if they've got all these coronaviruses equally, they'd like to get rid of them.
Yeah, we're able to detect multiple deficiencies in the innate immune systems of bats. Specifically in horseshoe bats, this is a defect in their ability to sense double-stranded RNA, but it's also known that they have a reduced ability to detect cytosolic DNA. So this is DNA that's in the wrong part of the cell, and that's also associated with viruses who have a DNA genome and replicate in the cytoplasm. So how exactly this reduced ability to react to the virus makes you better at tolerating a viral infection and therefore more likely to act as a reservoir, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to fill that void. But I think there's also a rather sort of scary possible conclusion that we can make from this as well, is that because horseshoe bats lack this defense and that we are one of the other few animals that lacks this defense, it's possible that humans are particularly sensitive to the spillover of coronaviruses from horseshoe bats. And obviously we've seen that this spillover can have quite dramatic consequences.
Sam Wilson of the MRC Centre for Virus Research based at Glasgow University, and his paper is a preprint you can find on medRxiv. Just search for prenylated. You'll have to work out the spelling for yourself though.